Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. I'm absolutely thrilled today to have fellow UT grad Charles Petrie with me. Charles, first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Tom.
Charles, you have written one of the most interesting books I've come across in a while. It's called Dark Texas, and we're going to take a deep dive into that. But before we do, I was wondering if you could tell our readers your professional background, which led you to the point where you wrote Dark Texas.
I'm really not sure my professional background has a lot to do with it. I wrote it because I was a citizen who lived through it like everybody else. I do have a PhD in computer science. I have done a lot of research, so I know how to research things. And that helped me in writing the book.
It strikes me that you're writing about not only some pretty high stakes matters, you wrote about it in the guise of fiction, but having lived through it as well, I think the way you have presented it is great storytelling. So, what I really thought was it's the storytelling part of you and the storytelling part of your academic and professional background that perhaps led to this great novel. Why don't we get into it? The Texas power grid. If there's a more malign topic in this state, I can't think of it. Other than having lived through several of our events, what brought you to this topic?
I did live through it like everybody else. But I'll tell you what inspired me, and this inspired all of my, in thinking about it, this inspires all of my scientific papers and books as well. I was annoyed. And I was annoyed because I started reading articles about it that said it could have been much worse. They attempted to explain how it could be much worse, and I would read these articles and then I would decide they failed. They didn't begin to scratch the surface of how it could have been much worse. And so I dug into it. And the more I dug into it, the worse it looked. And so I decided I have to write about this.
So, I do some work generally in the area of risk management in another part of my life when I'm not doing podcasts. And one of the things about risk management is you have multiple redundancies, backups. You can certainly have interconnected systems, but not everything is interconnected. And I'm afraid to say that's not the situation in Texas. So, could you begin to explain the complexity and the interconnectedness which puts us at such risk?
First off, everybody knows it's the lack of interconnectedness that puts us mainly at risk. The fact that we're not really connected to the rest of the power grid in the US. So we don't have that backup. When I looked into this, I was surprised by a couple of things. One is that a large part of what we depend upon for resilience in the electric grid in Texas is depending upon gas-fired plants and gas backups. It turns out that the gas pressure is dependent upon electricity. So in my book, I have a character explain who is so stupid, but it does. And there are 50,000 miles of pipeline, gas pipeline in Texas. Every 50 to 100 miles is a gas compressor, which puts pressure in the pipeline. At least 10% of these are electric, and some of them are very large as 60 megawatts. So you have to have a working power grid to have gas pressure. I was very surprised by that. I was also surprised by the fact that 82% of the black start generators in Texas were not operable at this time. Had the grid gone down, that would have been very serious. Do I need to explain what a black start generator is?
Please do.
Every large power plant requires one to restart. If a big power plant goes down, they can't start on their own. They have to have a small generator that's called a black start generator to restart the power plant. They don't have a black start generator for every power plant in Texas. That's too expensive. There are only 30 or fewer in the whole state. At the time of this event, maybe only 4 or 5 are operable. Now, that's quite serious for several reasons. First off, when you restart a grid from scratch, it takes a long time anyway, if everything works perfectly. However, ERCOT has been reassuring us that they do drills on these black start generators and everybody's prepared. But I don't know if they're doing drills, but 82% of them didn't work. Now, one of the reasons they didn't work is that some of them were gas fired. And again, if you have no electricity, you've got no gas, so they wouldn't have worked. To be fair, but I'm about not to be fair, many of these gas-fired generators were hybrid, so they could also run on stored fuel oil. But the fuel oil was not stored because Texas is a competitive energy market, and it wasn't cost effective to store this fuel. Others were not maintained. These black dirt generators are expensive to maintain. Why maintain them if you're never going to use them? Puts you in a disadvantage with everybody else. So we didn't have a lot going on. If they had all worked, it would have taken a long time to restore the grid because grids have to come up very carefully. But if you've only got 5 black start generators connected to power plants, that means you've got 5 power plants that you could possibly bring up. Now, what are the odds that you can bring them up? Well, if the plants are gas-fired themselves, the black start generator isn't going to do you any good. Even if it's got fuel oil, it can't start a power plant that runs on gas. Maybe 1 or 2 of them would be coal-fired, but 1/3 of the coal plants were down because their coal piles were frozen. So in the best case, it would have been a month before the grid could have been restarted. And what my book does is it makes a plausible worst case scenario that the grid would never have come back.
Why did you choose fiction to tell this all too real story?
I first started writing it out and it turned out to be too technical. Once you do all the, especially once I started looking at how equipment could fail, it was just too complicated. I said, also, people don't care about that stuff. That's a white paper. You write a white paper, you send it off to some legislator, and he goes, yeah, that's bad, and round cans it. If you want people to care, you've got to write a novel. And so I started writing a little short story. And so I'm an accidental novelist. I wrote this short story and it was only about 15,000 words long. It said most of what I wanted to say. And I got 3 kinds of feedback on it. One said, it's too Proustian.
As in Marcel Proust?
Yes,
Okay.
it's too technical. And where are the characters and the character arcs? So I had to learn to do that. And the more I learned, the longer the novel got, and the more of a novel it became. And we'll get into this later, but of course, the characters, once developed, started writing the novel, and I lost control.
That's what I want to actually get into now, which is I love to talk to other writers about the writing process. And almost all of my work's been in nonfiction. So typically I don't have characters. The times I've tried to write fiction, it's been my experience has been just what you articulated. They either took over or they told me what to write, basically. Can you explain that part of your creative process? Does it play out in your head like a movie? Are your fingers just the transmitters of what they're telling you? How does that work?
When I wrote, and of course, I'm just like you, I wrote nonfiction all my professional life. I have hundreds of papers and books, and often that's creative too. Often I didn't know exactly what I was going to say until my fingers did the typing. I would even say that sometimes. I'd say, I don't know. Let me see what my fingers say. It's much more true when you're doing storytelling and writing a novel with characters. And this wasn't true at the beginning of my book. But as I became better at what I was doing, which involved throwing out, say, the first 3 chapters and things like that, and continuing to look at other authors for inspiration, yeah, the characters started surprising me and saying things I didn't anticipate, and I found myself saying, "Oh, that was quite clever." Now, the way this works is I am typing, but they don't always say these things as I'm typing. For instance, something will be happening in a particular location, and I won't know why it's happening at that location. Right? Now, that is something I just started writing, but I'm writing as these things occur to me in my head. And somebody will say something, and I go, why are they saying that? This is not going to lead to where I wanted it to lead. And then all of a sudden it does. And really, I'll think, oh, I wish I had thought of that. That was great. And that starts happening all through the book. But the main thing that happened in this book is that people kept asking, first readers would say, can you say more about these minor characters? I started writing the minor characters more. And then the things they would say and do surprised me more because this is later in the writing process. And they really changed the meaning of what everything I had written before. Scenes that I had written before took on a new meaning now that I understood why these minor characters who were interacting in these scenes were doing what they were doing. It really changed the whole meaning. And then all kinds of things started happening. My main characters got more brutal than I anticipated. And the epilogue was much more brutal than I anticipated. But yeah, you've got to write the story. And if you try to change the story too much, the characters shut up.
How, or rather, were there any writers that you either intentionally or perhaps even subconsciously drew inspiration from to begin your writing, and has that evolved for you as well?
Oh, I have to say that the writers that influenced me when I started were Larry Niven and Jerry Purnell, science fiction writers from the 1970s. They wrote a disaster novel called Lucifer's Hammer, and I loved that. And what I loved about it was that they showed how different people in different scenarios throughout the whole process of this disaster reacted. What were the experience of different people? And I just really love that. And people don't do that kind of writing enough anymore. So that's what I set out to do. However, once I started writing, trying to be a writer, then I went back and I reread writers that I enjoyed. And so, what did they do here? One writer I've enjoyed is Tana French, who writes Irish murder mysteries, the first
Right.
one being The Searcher. I went back and I reread her first chapter at least 10 times. I go, what did she do to keep me engaged all through this chapter? She keeps changing the subject and foreshadowing what's going to happen, and yet I don't notice that. How is it I didn't notice? And oh, by the way, she's also really good at description and storytelling. So I just watched what she did. One of the authors I admire the most is a woman from the 30s named Beryl Markham, who, among other things, she was an aviator and wrote West with the Wind about the first person to fly from England to North America. And she just says what she sees, but her descriptive powers are beyond what I could ever aspire to. Hemingway said that she writes rings around the rest of us. And she just wrote an autobiography. She didn't mean to be a great writer, she just was. But it's interesting to read and reread these people. And then you can go and read authors that you admire when they write about writing. Elmore Leonard says, just write the facts. Don't embellish
Right.
it with writing. That's good. And I am a lean writer, as it turns out. You read Stephen King, you read who wrote on writing, and also read bad writers. You could go to Goodreads and see what people complain about in the writing, and don't do that. So I learned a lot of stuff from just going and rereading everybody and seeing what they did. But I can tell you one lesson I learned would stand everybody in good stead, which is never modify the word said, as in he said. Don't put any adverbs on that.
I'll keep that in mind when I turn to some fiction. Do you have a sequel or coming out, or are you working on a sequel?
I am working on a sequel. I pretty much have finished the first draft of the sequel. Now, the sequel is about the epilogue. I thought I finished this current novel, Dark Texas, about 10 times. And then when I finally got to the place where I could write the end, I was unhappy. I wait, something's missing. And for some reason, I had to write this epilogue that takes place 10 years later from the viewpoint of a kid who was only 10 years old when the first events happened. So now he's 20 years old. And it's just written from his viewpoint. I didn't know why I had to write this. It was unexpected and darker than I intended, but I'm not in charge anymore. And then I had to go back and write the sequel to explain this epilogue. There's a lot of questions this epilogue raises, and the characters just have more to say. So I had to do that. And when I'm writing the sequel, the characters completely take over. I'll be typing and I'll go, why did she say that? Or I know this one guy has to murder another guy in this scene, but I don't know how this is going to happen. So I really do start typing and I go, why are they by a bank? Why are they having this conversation? This can't lead to a murder. And then the murder happens. I go, oh, that was so clever. I wish I'd thought of that. And this, it's totally, the characters totally take over the sequel.
Let me change the focus just a little bit and ask you about working with Stony Creek Publishing. First
Sure.
of all, how did you get to Stony Creek and what was it like working with them?
I'll tell you, I did this also research on how to publish and how to write query letters to agents. And I worked on that. I researched agents, I researched query letters. I wrote 50 query letters. And after my 50 rejections, I realized that this was not going to work for me because agents are looking for a particular genre. And my book didn't fit in any of those genres. So I started looking at small presses and I researched small presses and I settled on a couple. And I really liked Stony Creek, and my experience with them has been super. Now, I have no other experience with any other publisher, but doing contracts was dead easy. Getting the final edits, getting the proofreading. One of the things I can say is I didn't expect everything to take so long. I've never gone through publishing before. It takes a long time, but from the publishing standpoint, it was easy. There were some unexpected things toward the end. So, in irony of ironies, this book was scheduled to be released on February 10th. It had to be delayed for a month because there was a winter storm power outage at the printer that delayed printing of the book. And
I think
then
that's appropriate.
that's appropriate. And then we were having trouble getting Amazon to deliver, and we turned out our first printing sold out. We didn't expect that. But that's been my experience, and it's been overall easy and good.
What advice might you give the aspiring author, I'm a lawyer, about bringing or navigating the publishing process, Charles?
You don't have to be a lawyer. Working with Lauren Steffi has been very easy at Stony Creek. And in fact, I am very indebted to Lauren for pushing my book. He believed in it, and that's made all the difference. So it's if you could find somebody who believes in your book, that's one thing. But the other thing I would just say is you need patience. It's more complicated and takes longer than you expect. You don't just give them a manuscript and they print it. That's not what happens.
As we turn, or rather, as we near the end of this podcast, Charles, I did want to ask you if our listeners wanted to connect with you, certainly find out more information about the book. What's the best place or places for them to go?
Certainly start with Stony Creek. There's a page for my book there, and there's something about me there. And what's there is pretty much also what's about if you go to Amazon and click on my author profile or Goodreads, my author profile on Goodreads, or you can just look me up on Facebook.
The social media that you've articulated, we're going to put all of that in the show notes. I'm really interested now to read your book even more than I was before. So I will definitely check it out. I wanted to thank you for taking the time to visit with me, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Okay. Thank you, Tom.